Hi, my dragons, and welcome to my den. We're not on my deck today because it is hot as can be out there, and so in my den it is a comfortable 64 degrees, heading on down to 61 degrees. So anyway, some housekeeping things. Today I was tested for the Rona, and I will know my results in 4 to 6 days. So fingers crossed, it's more on the 4 side, and we'll have class in person on Monday if the results come in. If they don't, and they come in Monday afternoon, then we'll see each other on Thursday. So that's the housekeeping thing for now. So we're continuing on lecture 1 about the history of human sexuality and the research and the study of human sexuality. And we left off at Islam. So now we're going to look at India. In India, there's a huge subcontinent colonized by the British and then given independence because of the likes of Gandhi. Gandhi was an ascetic, okay, and we learned about that last video. And Gandhi thought that denial, self-denial, which included sex, denial of sex, even though he was married, brought enlightenment. So that was Hinduism. Unlike Gandhi, the culture of India stresses sex as something that's important to bind the family. And they thought that if you had sexual fulfillment, that would lead to reincarnation at a higher level. Remember, the Hindus believe in reincarnation, okay? So they saw sex as a religious duty, something that you had to do. And India has one of the highest populations in the world. So it worked. They also developed the Kama Sutra, which is the book of sexual positions and things like that. If you have a chance to look at the Kama Sutra, maybe I'll put a link to it up there, and then you can explore in your own, try some of those unique positions. At my age, I'd probably break something. But anyway, it's a very famous book. And in the Far East, they pronounced Taoism. I know it starts with a T, but it's pronounced Taoism. And they regarded sex as a form of worship and harmony with all of nature. So in general, Asian societies, not looking at India as Asian, even though it is, I mean Asian in terms of Chinese, Japanese, and some of those countries in there, they look at harmony with nature and immortality as well. So all of those things were important when we talk about sexuality in Asian culture. So going on through historical eras, okay? Let's start with the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, there were conflicting attitudes about sexuality, which is nothing new because you see that in every era. But it was especially pronounced in the Middle Ages. They were looking at contradictory views of women. Either they were sinful, so they were very promiscuous, or they viewed women as saintly, as in the Virgin Mary. Okay, so those things you saw 2 different conflicting attitudes very pronounced in the Middle Ages. During the Protestant Reformation, though, we had a shying away from the teachings of the Catholic Church in Europe, and this was the era of Martin Luther. And so abstinence was something that the Catholics expected for their priests. And in the Reformation era, they thought, priests should be able to marry and have children, and that sex was something that was not just for procreation, but as a fulfillment, and that worked in concert with their ideas of religiosity, not apart as it was in the Catholic Church. So that makes a great true and false question too. All of these different types of eras or places that we're learning about make a great essay question. So put a little star by that for your first test. And the early Americans, well, the Puritans came from Europe, so they carried with them a lot of those Western beliefs. And they stressed, of course, sexuality to hold the family together, and it was for procreation. There were a lot of admonitions and penalties for things like adultery and infidelity, things like that. If you look at the writings of Nathaniel Hawthorne, my favorite American author, he wrote The Scarlet Letter, and it was all about infidelity. And so that gives you a good idea of the views at the time in early America. I know that in the Midwest you must get a different sort of history growing up. And I grew up in Massachusetts, which was a place where a lot of things happened with the Pilgrims and everything. And we had to read the writings of Puritans and Puritan pastors and all of their sermons and things like that. It was crazy. They really believed in fire and brimstone and harsh punishment by God for stepping out of the bounds of marriage and infidelity and all of that sort of thing. So they definitely believed in sex role stereotypes. So a woman was to bear children, hearth and home, staying at home and, raising the family and cooking and cleaning and all of those really fun things, okay? And then over in Europe, they had progressed from the Reformation era into the Victorian era, and this was named after Queen Victoria, who, this was a very conservative time, sexuality. However, there was those conflicting things going on, like we said before. And so it was not uncommon to see a lot of prostitution going on at the same time where during the Victorian era, they were very conservative about sexuality. They didn't talk about it. They didn't write about it. You could find some what we would consider porn of the day. Today we would consider it, nothing. But they did have those sorts of things back then, even though on the surface it looked like the Victorian era was ruling. They thought that women did not have any sexual feelings, that all the sexual feelings resided with the men. And when I say they, probably it was the men writing that, not the women. And there was a belief that that sex drained men of their vitality. So we see the same kind of myth carrying through today, but in a different form. If any of you ever watched the movies Rocky, there's a part in Rocky where the coach is telling Rocky not to have sex before a fight, and he said something like, "Women weaken knees." In other words, like don't have sex before a big match because that'll make you weak. And I have heard people today, athletes today, say the same sort of thing, and coaches say the same sort of thing. There is no relationship between that, no empirical scientific relationship, so you don't really need to abstain before a big game or something like that. One would think that having sex before a big game would make you happier, maybe play better, I don't know. So prostitution was common, and there was a lot of study around sex, which we would call sexology today. And as I mentioned before, that is a field, and Sigmund Freud was popular during this era, even though it was the Victorian era. So your book goes from Victorian era up to the 1960s, like nothing happened in between that, and believe me, it did. So what happened between the Victorian era and the 1960s? Well, we had a couple of world wars, and during those times, the guys went overseas, and some women, because they were nurses and Red Cross and things like that. And yes, they were having sex. We didn't stop having sex because, the World War I people had babies, and we had the soldiers for the World War II people. And then they had sex, and then we have the baby boomers in the Vietnam era. So yeah, just because the book takes a big leap like that, yeah, there were still sexuality going on. And it was interrupted by things like the Great Depression, the Spanish flu, the World War I, World War II, that sort of thing. So the focus was not so much on sexuality. What really happened was when they came back, we had the GI Bill, and there was a really renewed interest in the scientific or empirical study of sexuality. And that's why there's that big gap, because, there was a different thing going on. There was a lot of stuff going on in the United States, so that's what you have. But definitely there was a lot of interest in sex, and people were having sex, and it didn't stop just because there were world wars. But during the 1960s, that was my era, there was a sexual revolution, that's what they call it. And in the 1950s, when the guys had the GI Bill, and they were basically settling back into society after World War II, there was some researchers, Kinsey, which we'll see the Kinsey movie as well for one of the threaded discussions coming up. And he started to do research. He was the first really good researcher who started doing empirical studies at WashU in St. Louis, Missouri, but he was from Indiana. And I think he started at Indiana. But anyway, it was very controversial, as you can imagine. So at the time, it was pretty conservative. Society wasn't ready to hear that sort of thing, and it shocked a lot of people. And he thought of it as, look, this is a need. You have people who don't know basic sexuality, and we have to research this. And so he did a lot of research, and it was pretty shocking at the time, but now it's very mild compared to the things that we research today. So science has really progressed today in terms of the scientific study of sexuality. By the way, that's the name of a group, Scientific Study of Society for the Scientific Study of Sexuality, or the Quad. We call it Quad S because it's Society, Scientific Study of Sexuality. And so you can belong to that group. It's very interesting. They have conferences and all of that stuff. But so it brought, the 60s brought, and 50s and 60s brought a resurgence of let's do scientific research on a topic that we should all know about. And he started doing research on wasps, and then started comparing reproduction in wasps to human reproduction. And that's what got him on human sexuality, which was really interesting. So in the 60s, we had, my dog just walked in, different dog. We had a big sexual revolution. A lot of the people who were like my age back in the day did not like the conservative Republican views, and so conservative reviews of sexuality, and they wanted to be free. Sexual expression. 1969 was the Summer of Love, or 68, Summer of Love, and people's sexual attitudes became more liberal, and people started behaving in a more liberal fashion as well. And things that brought the sexual revolution upon us as a country was the Vietnam War. A lot of the younger guys were going off to war, and they didn't know if they would ever have sex, or if they would ever have sex again, so it became really, do or die, let's do it now. And so we saw a lot of people going overseas and coming back with children, which was the same thing that happened, by the way, in World War I and World War II. People were afraid of the nuclear weapons. This was something we saw in World War II. What we saw happen in World War II with nuclear weapons was really horrifying, completely horrifying, that human population could be wiped out in the blink of an eye. And so that propelled people into sexual behavior, okay? Then we had the development of the birth control pill. So this liberalized sexuality because people could have sex and not worry about getting pregnant, having children to care for. You could still have sexually transmitted diseases. The pill didn't take care of that aspect. It only took care of pregnancy. And then the mass media. We had a lot of shows that hit the airwaves that were considered extremely controversial, and things that hadn't been seen on TV before. Of course, TV was in its teenage years, having started earlier, and a lot of people decried some of the things we were seeing on TV as being just really too sexual. And if you look at programs like Laugh-In or Flip Wilson or things like that, I mean, really it wasn't, by today's standards, it's nothing. It really is nothing. When the Beatles appeared for the first time on the Ed Sullivan Show, the World War II babies, my parents' generation and my grandparents' generation thought that they were, oh my God, look at their hair, they're hippies, they're talking about all this, they're singing about sex, it's the ruin of the whole country. And it's really kind of funny because by today's standards, you have tweaking on stage and everything else, and that would have just killed my parents and grandparents. They would have been like, oh no. So it's really interesting. But what that did was it prompted a discussion in this country about the portrayal of sexuality and how common should it be, and should we talk about it in the classroom and things like that. So we're going to leave it at the sexual evolution. I'll pick it up in part 2, and we will continue with this PowerPoint.